Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Joseph the Believer podcast. My name is Josh Chandler. I'm joined here by Cameron Mayer. And today we're going to talk a little bit about Doctrine and Covenants Section 1. And we're going to talk a lot about the the theme of this podcast is that Joseph really believed what he was preaching. And we're trying to see him as a believer. But another theme of this podcast, and we'll probably put out some more episodes that have to do with this more specifically, is why does Joseph matter? What is Joseph giving us that we can't get elsewhere? And I think we're going to actually find a lot of people, a lot of listeners will be very surprised when they actually get into it and learn all the things that maybe they didn't realize that are quite unique about the restoration. So today is going to be about that. It's going to be why did so many people listen to Joseph Smith? And it goes along with Doctrine and Covenants Section 1, because in Doctrine and Covenants Section 1, for those of you who maybe don't remember what Doctrine and Covenants Section 1 is doing there at the beginning, I don't know, Cam, do you want to summarize Doctrine and Covenants Section 1, what it's doing there, how it's different from the other sections of the Doctrine and Covenants? Maybe I'm happy to do it, but I thought you might do a good job with that.
Yeah, well, for sure. So, DNC 1 is a preface to the Doctrine and Covenants. As they're putting together the Book of Commandments back in the time that this was being compiled, they thought, well, we ought to have a preface to this book to sort of introduce it. And there were a couple of people that tried their hand at writing one and felt like it just wasn't quite good enough. And so they went to Joseph, and he sat down and in one sitting, by the voice of revelation, dictated the preface to the book. So it's the only book that I know of that has a preface written by the Lord.
So the other thing I think is worth noting, Cam, is that the reason we're talking about Doctrine and Covenants Section 1 today is not actually so much because this is, we're not necessarily going through the Doctrine and Covenants in order. Don't expect us to do that. We're not necessarily going to follow like a come follow me approach. But Doctrine and Covenants Section 1 sets up a really nice way of looking at Joseph in terms of his historical context. And what we want to talk about today is the historical context into which Joseph Smith's revelation was being inserted. And this is important. The reason it's really important is because if you want to understand why the church was so successful, and actually you just want to understand what early Latter-day Saints believed, you have to understand what it is that they came from. And it actually isn't the same. Many, all of the early Latter-day Saints came from widely varying religious traditions. And I'm not going to make an argument today about that there really were at least two sort of branches and then a third that kind of comes in of believers and traditions from which believers in the Latter-day Saint tradition came. Um, but I really wanted to position this first by noting that the Lord was aware of the history. He was aware of all of what was going on, and much of that had been inspired in one way or another, and set up deliberately so that um, the restoration could gain adherence, could gain the kind of purchase that it wound up gaining. It was really important not to bring up a restoration like this during a time when it couldn't be successful. And so the ground had to be prepared and plowed and ready so it could receive the seed that Joseph was there to plant. And so we want to talk about kind of what the ground looked like, because I think a lot of Latter-day Saints, it's something we really don't know much about. And I don't think it's covered adequately in hardly any histories. Um, Either people tend to know a lot about it themselves and just assume that readers do, or they just tend to sort of skip past it and assume that other things are more important. Um, and not understand just how important uh, the religious context into which Joseph's revelations were being inserted is. So that's kind of what this episode is going to be about, and that's why we started with DNC 1, but we're going to move on to a whole bunch of just interesting historical stuff that I think will help you understand. And at the end, what we want you to understand is why Joseph was so important and what kind of questions he was answering for people that had been around for, in many cases, hundreds, as many as 300 years by the time Joseph came along.
So what you're kind of saying is framing, that what this does is it orients us to understand the worldview that Joseph Smith would have had, and that all of the people that were getting involved in this church would have had, and this work would have had. Is that fair?
Yeah, and I even add to that, it's easy to think that Joseph Smith is the only person that matters for early LDS beliefs and practices. Um, in part, that's because we have a very hierarchical structure today where there's a lot of top-down kind of stuff. It just wasn't the same back then, in part because of communication. For a long time, many years, you've got uh, a branch of the church in Missouri that is essentially being run with very little interference or knowledge almost from Joseph by Oliver Cowdery and by the Whitmers and by William W. Phelps to a lesser extent. A whole group of folks down there in Missouri um, who are doing their own thing. And Joseph himself put all kinds of emphasis on councils, the same things that you hear today in an LDS leadership training. Joseph was all about the power of councils, was fully committed to discussions and to governing by consensus, even though at the end of the day, everybody knew that when, as and if Joseph got a revelation from the Lord, everybody was going to obey it. But there was still a lot of counseling on the day-to-day stuff. And so those people who were involved in that, their religious beliefs, their assumptions, what they bring to the table became a really important part of what all of us now experience as that Latter-day Saint doctrine, beliefs, and practices. One of the things that I love the most about this Doctrine and Covenants section 1 is, like you said, Cam, the Lord is writing his own preface. The Lord is, they tried to write it themselves. They tried all these different ways of doing it. And in the end, it is the Lord putting all of these revelations in context. And what is the context that he's putting these revelations in? Well, he says, this is verse 8, and verily I say unto you that they who go forth bearing these tidings unto the inhabitants of the earth, to them is given power to seal both on earth and in heaven the unbelieving and the rebellious, yea, verily, to seal them up unto the day when the wrath of God shall be poured out upon the wicked without measure, unto the day when the Lord shall come to recompense unto every man according to his work. Prepare ye, this is, I skipped a verse, but 12. Prepare ye for that which is to come, for the Lord is nigh, and the anger of the Lord is kindled, and his sword is bathed in heaven, and it shall fall upon the inhabitants of the earth. So this is positioning very, very clearly the Doctrine and Covenants as and the Restoration as a millennial or a premillennial work. And this is really interesting and very important because, as we're going to talk about, there's a whole group of people who've been prepared to hear exactly this message. And so, in verse 17, wherefore I, the Lord, knowing the calamity which should come upon the inhabitants of the earth, called upon my servant Joseph Smith Jr. and spake unto him from heaven, and gave him commandments, and also gave commandments to others that they should proclaim these things unto the world. And the idea is this is the fulfillment of all of the prophecies you've been waiting for. I don't know if you have anything else you want to say about Doctrine and Covenants section 1, Cam, but I think this is really there's a whole bunch of interesting things one could do. And that one of the things I find fascinating is that when you read the Book of Mormon, when you read the Doctrine and Covenants, you have a sense, we all come to it with a sense of what's going on because we grew up either in it or we've had a lot of exposure to it, and it's become second nature to us. But Doctrine and Covenants section 1 is giving you a pretty tight outline of exactly what Joseph's latter-day mission is supposed to be. So if you want to know what Joseph Smith was supposed to be doing, why he was supposed to be doing it, what the purpose of this dispensation of the gospel is, and we'll talk about dispensations of the gospel, it's all right here in a very nice, tight outlined form in section 1.
Yeah, there's a way in which what D&C 1 is doing is framing prophetically the work that is about to follow, right? And not just the work as in the revelations that are going to follow, but all of the effort and the sacrifice and the labor and the religion and the church that accompany those. So this sort of stands kind of as the door frame or the lens, you might say, to properly understand what's this whole work about. What is Joseph up to? What is this church about? A lot of it is repurposing language from prophecy, particularly from Isaiah. There's a lot of Isaiah in here, and it gets cut and pasted and moved around so that it flows kind of as one seamless thought from beginning to end. And it's taking the prophecies of old and it's sort of narrowly pointing them and applying them to our situation. So it's grounding.
Yeah, when you say that, Cam, it occurs to me that, I have conversations from time to time with folks about Joseph and about the Book of Mormon and about these things as you do, I'm sure. And one of the things that I hear sometimes is sort of a very casual way to tossing aside the Book of Mormon, tossing aside the Doctrine and Covenants, tossing aside all the revelations of Joseph. Like, well, he was steeped in King James English and steeped in the Bible, and he knew this stuff, and so yeah, I mean, this is just like what he was steeped in coming out. But if you actually, that is, and I say this with love and respect for the people who feel this way. I think there are other reasons why they want that to be true, but that's an exceptionally lazy analysis. Doctrine and Covenants section 1 by itself completely belies that as a possibility because of, to your point, the level of knowledge of not just the prophecies of Isaiah or what's supposed to happen in the last day. There's a very coherent, quite clear, quite internally consistent picture of what's going to happen in the last days. And it's never laid out by Joseph. There's no creed and it doesn't match on to anything exactly that was already out there. It's got a little bit of this and a little bit of that and pieces of this and pieces of that. And some things that lots of people believed at the time of Joseph turn out to be true. And other things, his teachings turn out to reject those things, and other things that nobody had supposed. This idea of there being 3 kingdoms, completely and totally original, all melded together in this beautiful kind of tapestry, is exactly what you would expect if it were a revelation. You would expect God to find many things that were in the earth because of all of the teachings that have been there for all these years that were correct, that were true. And you would expect God to have many things to reveal that were totally new and very unexpected. And then you would expect there to be some things that God was not pleased with and that needed to be changed. And that's exactly what you find. And you find it in a very sophisticated way with lots of details that are unexpected. If Joseph were writing for himself, from himself, what you would expect is nothing original. You would expect a compilation of things, and Joseph sort of going through and picking among the various doctrines that are out there in the world and sort of accepting this one, rejecting that one, accepting this one, rejecting that one. And some of that does happen, but it is never so straightforward as you would think. And in fact, it's never presented, very rarely, I should say, is it presented as a discussion of what's already out there. Instead, it is just a teaching of the truth, which happens to respond to something that happens to be out there. And actually, we don't even know to what extent Joseph knows about all of these theological or doctrinal or timeline, dispensational kind of arguments that when we can read it, we can kind of see some of that stuff in there. It's not clear to me that he knew about any of that stuff, but even if he did, what he does is very consistent with a revelatory prophet, and is not actually very consistent at all with a sort of idea that you have this simplistic young man who is just kind of steeped in religion and is able to produce these incredibly complex pastiches, really, of what was out there, rejecting some of what was out there, and then also adding new things that
I throw a
fit
quote
just the
in.
way that makes sense.
Could I throw a quote in from Richard Bushman? This is something that I love. We might
Please.
have talked about this before. So he's talking about Joseph's, I don't know if ability is the word or tendency, somewhere in the middle of that, to take heaven and to unite it with earth, right? And that this is sort of the hallmark and the heartbeat of his ministry, is bringing heaven down to earth and bringing earth up to heaven. Brigham Young, as a matter of fact, says something like that on one occasion when he's talking about, the power of Joseph's teaching was that he took heaven, figuratively speaking, and brought it down to earth, and he took earth and brought it up to heaven. So in a similar spirit, which, by the way, I think that is the spirit of prophecy. That's the spirit in which Christ lives his life as well, right? It's uniting heaven and earth. And that's what prophets do by taking the divine and bringing it down into like the tangible, into the mundane. So here's what Richard Bushman said. He said, no passage better captures Joseph Smith's restoration than D&C 128. And that's the letter that Joseph writes to the church where he's saying, what do we hear in the gospel? A voice of gladness, Michael and Gabriel and diverse angels in Seneca County and on the banks of the Susquehanna. And so he says, no passage better captures Joseph's restoration than that. Mingling the names of diverse angels, Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, with specific mundane places that one could locate on a map. Fayette, Seneca County, Colesville, Broome County, and the banks of the Susquehanna River. That mixing of the mystical with the plain was pure Joseph Smith. This very concreteness gave him his highest pleasure. And I'd say that is kind of the spirit in which to approach the principle of revelation, and specifically these revelations, which is you're taking these lofty prophecies, these ancient prophecies, these ideas that are very high in terms of their ability to explain things and outline patterns, and bringing them down into like the particular, this is our modern world, in the 1800s. After 1800 years of history post-Christ, this is how we situate ourselves in the divine narrative, in the story, right? This is how we can understand all of these churches today, right? We're now putting it in the language of prophecy. We're framing it in the language of scripture so that you can clearly see where you fit in the story and participate accordingly. So when I think of a revelation like this, where it's taking and repurposing and applying verses from Isaiah or from ancient prophecy, or combining these in some way or other, like the Lord does in the first vision when he says they draw near to me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They seek for commandments, the doctrines of men. They have a form of godliness, but deny the power thereof. That's taking several different
Yeah,
scriptural ideas and putting them together, as a sort of prophetic or scriptural description of a particular thing. And that's exactly what prophecy and revelation is all about.
I love it. So, um, yeah, love that. Hugh Nibley says that, in fact, um, one of the things that's most interesting about the way the ancients work is that they just have no compunction about reusing and repurposing and changing and just tweaking a little bit all of the stuff that's gone before into these new combinations. And that the sort of the language of the Lord, the way the Lord speaks to us, is deemed to be exactly in that way. Um, I loved what you said about situating us in sort of an ancient narrative. I think, you know, Alexander Campbell gives some interesting thoughts. And I think if you want a really interesting, uh, what I would take to be a defense of the Book of Mormon in many ways, you can read Alexander Campbell's 1831 publications called Delusions, and it was actually published in his newspaper, the Millennial Harbinger. Alexander Campbell was one of the most famous preachers of the 19th century, and in fact was the leader of the Disciples of Christ movement that Sidney Rigdon was a very significant part of. Campbell was sort of a theologian, and Rigdon was actually almost served for Campbell and for some of the other folks in the movement, or was thought of as this incredible preacher who was very good at preaching the theology that they were the ones who were sort of designing. Um, you know, um, and it was kind of a primitive Christianity return stuff. But Alexander Campbell has this very fascinating set of criticisms about the Book of Mormon. And what's really interesting about them is they wind up supporting faith. And the only reason I bring this up is because it's the same basic principle we're talking about. Um, here's one of the examples he says. He says, okay, why is it that Lehi is positioned in the Book of Mormon as having been from the tribe of Joseph? What does that mean? And why is he leaving at the time that he's leaving? So, one of the things people talk about all the time is this idea that the Indians were descended from the lost 10 tribes, and people pretend like this was somehow an inspiration for, or even the source of, the Book of Mormon. Overlooking, of course, that the 10 tribes were lost long, long, long before, several hundred years before we have Lehi and Nephi, and that in general, um, Lehi and Nephi are living at Jerusalem with the Jews right before the carrying away into Babylon. The 10 tribes were destroyed by Assyria a couple hundred years before that. It's not the 10 tribes. If you were writing a false narrative, you would write the 10 tribes, but that isn't what Joseph's doing. But what is interesting, and this is so on the one hand, Campbell talks about all these things he doesn't like, that he thinks that Joseph did wrong, and he's upset because Lehi is a descendant of Joseph and is exercising priesthood authority, which he shouldn't be able to do because he's not a Levite. But then Campbell goes through it also. Passes the Book of Mormon off and says, well, it's also no good. It's also false because it talks about every single controversy that's existed and resolves so many of them, and I'm trying to see if I can find the exact quote here. Oh yeah. This prophet Smith wrote on the plates of Nephi in his Book of Mormon every error and almost every truth discussed in New York for the last 10 years. He decides all the great controversies: infant baptism, ordination, the Trinity, regeneration, repentance, justification, the fall of man, the atonement, transubstantiation, fasting, penance, church government, religious experience, the call to the ministry, the general resurrection, eternal punishment, who may baptize, and even the question of Freemasonry, republican government, and the rights of man. And the reason I think this is interesting is because that actually makes sense, because what we're doing here in this in the Book of Mormon and also in Doctrine and Covenants section 1 is we are, to your point, Cam, we're trying to address the concerns of today and then position them in a really ancient story that goes all the way back to the beginning. And the evidence is everywhere that that's exactly what Joseph sees himself as doing.
Yeah, well said. The other thing I would say is that these things don't happen in a vacuum. As a matter of fact, there's this idea that Joseph refutes, which is a popular idea in Christianity, which is a sort of creation ex nihilo, right? Which means out of nothing. And instead vies for something more like a creation. I'm not sure how you'd say it, ex materia. Is that right? You know
Something
Latin
like
better than
that,
I
yeah.
do. But it's taking
Which is a
pre-existing
very low bar,
material.
Ken.
Sorry, what was that?
I said, knowing Latin better than you might be a fairly low bar.
The idea is it's taking pre-existing material and repurposing it. It's ordering it and organizing it, right, in a way that is meaningful in a new way. And so from the beginning, this is the pattern for how the Lord interacts with mankind, right? Taking the pre-existing things, whether it's the controversies of the day, or whether it's the language that we speak in, or taking what's already out there and molding it and pulling it together in a way that manifests his will, right? This is the idea of God coming down and dwelling in tabernacle of clay, right? And that's
Yeah.
Christ is the Word made flesh. Revelation manifests itself within one's cultural context, within the context of the things that they're wrestling with. And so this is the manner in which people exercise faith, and it's where the Lord meets them. There's this idea that as you draw near to the Lord, he draws near to you, that heaven and earth kind of mutually reach for each other. And the Lord speaks to us in our own language. So anyway, perhaps we've taken enough time on this point.
Yeah. Well, it's a great point. It's very worth noting. So let's talk a little bit about what we Latter-day Saints tend to think of as the great apostasy. That was not a term that was unknown to folks in Joseph's time. Alexander Campbell, in fact, refers to specifically the apostasy in his critique of the Book of Mormon.
We read a quote from Roger Williams last time where I think he references the same idea.
Yeah, certainly it was a well-known idea. So here's what I want to do. Cam, I'm just going to start this with something that hopefully this isn't tedious for everybody, but I think the point that's being made in this, there's a book here, it's called Enthusiasm. I don't necessarily, unless you just love the history of heresy, I don't necessarily say that anybody ought to read it. Ronald Knox was a Catholic, an English Catholic, and he wrote a very long, exceptionally detailed history of what he calls enthusiasms. And really what he means is heresies. And he has a really lovely explanation in here about how churches break up and what happens and why people come to believe different things than what they used to believe. And I think it's worth considering. So I'm just going to read a little bit here. There is, I would say, a recurrent situation in church history, using the word church in the widest sense to refer to all Christians, where an excess of charity threatens unity. You start with a clique, an elite of Christian men, and more importantly, women, who are trying to live a less worldly life than their neighbors, to be more attentive to the guidance directly felt, they would tell you, of the Holy Spirit. More and more, by a kind of fatality, you see them draw apart from their co-religionists, a hive ready to swarm. There is usually a provocation on both sides. On the one part, there are cheap jokes made at the expense of over-godliness and acts of stupid repression by unsympathetic authorities. On the other hand, there is contempt of the half-Christian, ominous references to old wine and new bottles, to the kernel and the husk. And then, while you hold your breath and turn away your eyes in fear, the break comes. Condemnation by the authorities or secession. What difference does it actually make? In the end, a fresh name has been added to the list of Christianities. This pattern is always repeating itself, not in outline merely, but in detail. Almost always, the enthusiastic movement is denounced as an innovation, and yet it claims to be preserving or to be restoring the primitive discipline of the church. Almost always, the opposition is twofold. Good Christian people who do not relish an eccentric spirituality find themselves in unwelcome alliance with worldlings who do not relish any spirituality at all. Almost always, schism begets schism. Once the instinct of discipline is lost, the movement breeds rival prophets and rival coteries at the peril of its internal unity. Always the first fervors evaporate, prophecy dies out, and the charismatic is merged in the institutional. And then the process begins again.
Can I make a meta
Cam.
observation real fast? My observation is that within the pattern that Christ sets up, which is to say his life ends up being a microcosm for what he intends to create in the world, right? So his atonement, let's say, his self-sacrifice that brings forth a resurrection is intended to then ripple out from him and be the pattern that revives and redeems all of creation. And so this is why I say in a very non-arbitrary way, the life and the death and the resurrection of Christ are planted like a seed in the earth that start to grow out and redeem it from the inside out. That being said, there's a pattern set up within the heart of Christianity from the beginning, within the seed, that sort of accounts for its own death and subsequent resurrection, its own breakdown, and then its revivification. And part of that, I think, has to do with Antichrist, right? That's part of the story, that there's a period of time where evil tyranny sort of gets the upper hand on the unity that was once created. And then there's a period of darkness, and then there's kind of this resurrection. And so I think if you look at the Christian story through this sort of meta lens, that's one way you can understand what's going on with the restoration, right? That there begins to be this breakdown of the unity that was created in Christianity, and in part because it was joined to corrupt things that needed to be separated from. But within that breakdown, there then becomes opportunity for a resurrection, a glorious return to what once was, and perhaps with even greater power now because of the death that it descended into. So as we're talking about, I think, sort of how Christianity has this kind of trajectory where it starts to break down, and then there are smaller and smaller versions of the same pattern replicating over and over again. And then from within that chaos, the restoration comes forward. I think that's the perhaps one of the meta ways to think about what's going on here.
This process that Ronald Knox is talking about, this is happening. This begins, and we can argue whether Ronald Knox makes the point in this book that it doesn't actually begin with Luther and the Reformation. It's going on all along. It's just that Luther and the Reformation was the one that was actually successful in gaining a lot of adherents. This is the process by which new Christianities are brought into the world. And this process was going on all over the globe, but especially in England, and then in New England, and then throughout the sort of new United States. I mean, by the time Joseph was born, the Constitution is only 16 years old, if you can imagine. This is a very, very, very new country, and has, a ton of ties still remaining with its mother country and with all of the sort of culture and the religion that has been around for all this time. So with that in mind, I wanted to talk about some of the isms, enthusiasms, the things that had been heavily debated and discussed prior to the restoration of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And I want to try to locate for folks where early Latter-day Saints would have fallen on the spectrum. And we talked a little bit last time about where Joseph may have fallen on the spectrum himself. But I just want to talk about some of the things that are out there in the in the universe, or in the air, in the atmosphere, so to
Zeitgeist.
speak, that are making this. What's that?
Is that in the zeitgeist?
Yeah, oh yeah, nice, nice. Yes, the zeitgeist, the spirit of the age, um, that into which the restoration is being inserted. So
And can I
I think it
pause you just a
makes,
moment and say, I
yes,
think one of the reasons it's beneficial to talk about this context, I mean, what we talked about in the previous episode, I thought was fantastic, because with enough context, the pieces sort of just come together very naturally. Let's say when we're talking about the first vision specifically, but any episode in church history, once you see the context, then it all becomes very like it's the logical conclusion in some ways. It takes the weirdness out of a lot of it, or the
I agree.
unfamiliarity. I think the other thing it does is, we sort of have this tendency, I think, in the church to think about Christ and the apostles, when scripture is being recorded, and then there's kind of this 1800-year gap, more or less, where there's no scripture being recorded, and then it picks back up again with Joseph Smith. And in the meantime, it's sort of people kind of like vaguely meandering around in the dark. America happens to get founded, and then we stumble into another restoration. And maybe that's kind of a rough way of putting it, but what we don't generally talk about is the way that the Lord is involved, and the impact and the ripple effect that Christ's life and ministry has on the world in a very non-arbitrary way. I mean, down to like the fibers of Western culture, Western civilization, in a way that ultimately bring about the restoration. I think there's an argument to be made that the wheat and the tares is the prophetic framework in which to understand kind of the rise, the birth and the rise of Western civilization as we know it. And that then creates the context, let's say, into which the restoration comes. So it's important to trace, I think, the lineage of these things, just because it frames not only how people, like the situation that people would have been in at this point, right? But how the Lord is involved, to the extent that man will let him be. Is that fair?
Absolutely. And I would even add this. If you don't have these things, and there's a million, if you don't believe me, don't take my word for it. There's a million quotes from uh, Latter-day Saint leaders about this. Without a reformation, there is no restoration. There's zero chance Joseph Smith comes along in a Catholic state in which the church and the state are one, and everything is Catholic, and all of a sudden starts asking himself which church he's going to join, or for a born again experience. All of those things have to be in place, or there's no first vision. All of those things has to be in place, or there's no Moroni. The other thing that's worth noting is one of the tasks that we have here that we've set for ourselves in this podcast is to situate Joseph as a believer, as a Christian, first and foremost. This matters because a lot of people have tried to situate Joseph as something else, as a charlatan, as a magician, as a ignorant farm boy, which he would not have even argued with, but who never really had any interest in religion. But this was sort of this weird you can go into lots of psychology of analyzing why somebody would do it. My point is, what I'm trying to show, among many other things, is that the context for Joseph Smith that best explains Joseph Smith is a religious Christian context.
A genuine one.
And it is not all of these, and it's genuine. It's not all of these other things. It is not, all of those things are so far from explaining Joseph when compared to the sort of paradigm we're going to present, that I'm hopeful that people will find it as compelling as I do. So that's one of the reasons to present it in this context, is because it's always presented, not always, it's often presented in other contexts that are just not accurate. So here's what I'm going to do. What we're going to do, we've talked about sort of the idea that that what happens in the process of a creation of a new sect is sort of this feeling that the old ways are no good, that there's something that we have to do to fix them, and that creates a new denomination or a set of beliefs that are new. What I would like to focus on here is just about half a dozen, we'll call them, themes that show up strongly in Joseph Smith's in the Restoration, that were all over the place, amongst mostly the heretics, but also the sort of mainstream Puritans who would have founded the United States of America and who were still, at the time of Joseph Smith, sort of the old line, most respectable way to do Christianity. And I just want to cover some themes. The reason I want to cover these themes is because these themes, they aren't specific necessarily to one denomination, although often you'll have breakoffs that are focused on one theme, for example. One of the most obvious ones is, Anabaptists who believe in a baptism of believers instead of an infant baptism. They're really focused on just that one thing. But there are lots of things like that that are making their appearance that make Joseph Smith's restoration, the Lord's work that he's doing through Joseph, make sense to people and resonate with them. So the first one of those that I think is worth talking about is this idea of millenarianism. And I think it'll surprise a lot of listeners to hear that it turns out every Christian in the history of Christianity has believed that they were living in the last days. Literally every single one of them. Why? Well, if you read the New Testament, Jesus does not seem to make it sound like it's a long ways away. And in fact, at the end of the book of Revelation, John says, "Come quickly, Lord Jesus." And the Christians, the early Christians, did not expect it to be thousands of years before Jesus came again. They expected it would be any minute, any time. That's how they looked at it. And I know, Cam, you don't probably have a great recollection of what it was like leading up to the year 2000, but a lot of folks had ideas that the year 2000 was a banner or marker year that meant something very specific and very important with respect to the second coming of Jesus Christ. Well, it will surprise a lot of listeners probably to know that the year 1000 was exactly the same. And that in the year 1000, many, many, many Christians believed that the second coming of Jesus was imminent. The destruction of the Catholic Church, or we won't call it the destruction because it was never destroyed, but the reformation of the Catholic Church and then the breakaway from the Catholic Church got to the point where Reformed Christians like the Puritans who founded the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and actually Rhode Island was founded by Puritans as well. Roger Williams wasn't a Puritan until he wasn't, and so the Plymouth colony, which became part of Massachusetts, was founded by people who were essentially Puritans but had a different belief about what the value of the church was. These people believed that the Pope was the Antichrist and that the defeat of the Pope would be the thing that would usher in the second coming of Jesus. They believed themselves to be taking part in a broad story, something like what Doctrine and Covenants Section 1 is doing, that would culminate in the second coming of Jesus Christ. The folks who came to settle the Massachusetts Bay Colony in particular were Puritans who were seeking to create a new Jerusalem, a Zion, a place, a society in which the laws of God and the laws of the land would no longer be distinct from one another. And this society would be the thing that would be able to defeat the Antichrist, the Pope, or sometimes people thought it was the King of England, or sometimes people thought it was, just like today, there was all kinds of speculation about what it was, who was the Antichrist, and how the Antichrist would be defeated, and would be the ones who would prepare the world to usher in the second coming of Jesus Christ. So this idea that we are in the last days, this is not something new. It's not new to Joseph Smith, and it's certainly not new to us today. This was a huge theme that was really, really important to many people throughout Christianity, but particularly in the United States. And in fact, the idea that the United States of America, or at least this land, would play a huge role in preparing the world for the second coming of Jesus Christ was an old Puritan idea. It'd been around for, by the time of Joseph Smith, since, the 1620s and 30s. And so, that's a long time. It's about 200 years on this continent that there was a special role for the United States of America, or at least for this land.
I was going to say, can I throw something in real fast?
Please.
And to tie this back to a comment I was making earlier, I believe that Christ sets a very real pattern for how his followers are going to live and see and experience the world thereafter. And this is tracked for the last 2,000 years, which is, number one, overturning tyranny, right? Some kind of revolution where the first will be last and the last will be first, and the meek will inherit the earth, and the humble and those that are cast out will be exalted. This is the symbol that you sort of get, and that Christians rally around, in Christ being lifted up on the cross as a sort of exaltation, right? That someone who was crucified, which was usually a punishment that was reserved for like the lowest of the low, slaves or the lowest class of society, that you'd be turning that on its head, right? And making that the greatest thing, and that the thing at the top had become corrupt. This impulse that then follows is necessarily a very Christian impulse, and it fits. I don't know if hand in glove is exactly the right phrase, but it fits very seamlessly with the notion that the spirit of Christianity is to live as though you were at the end of the age. And so I just want to take a moment to observe that and to notice that for anyone that maybe finds it concerning that everyone since the time of Christ to today thinks they're living in the last days. I actually think there's a sense in which that spirit is a necessary way to live and to engage with Christianity, and it's living in that way and exercising faith to that end that ultimately does bring it about. So, and I think the book of Revelation, for what it's worth, is actually connecting the sacrifices, the persecution, the death, the opposition that they're facing, the potential martyrdoms that they're going to partake in. It's connecting that to the ultimate redemption of the world and saying, look, what you're doing now fills up a divine ledger in a way that is ultimately meaningful. The sacrifices you're making now do contribute to the redemption of the world. um, in a way that is outside of time as we normally think about it. So I think it's worth talking about.
No, I think it does. I think it's important to, if you really want to get interesting about it, the folks at Qumran who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls, what, 80, 70 something, we think, and maybe even just a little earlier than that. Um, there was a German guy who first was assisting in translating the Dead Sea Scrolls, and who says, and this is one of my favorite little weird coincidences in the world, coincidences in scare quotes. He says the Qumran saints should have been called Latter-day Saints. That's what they called themselves. That's what we ought to translate the words that the folks in who are writing the Dead Sea Scrolls. That's how they referred to themselves, as Latter-day Saints. But we can't do that because that term has been co-opted by this weird sect out there in Utah. They've already taken the name Latter-day Saints, so we can't use that. But that would be the best translation to describe the folks in Qumran who are writing the Dead Sea Scrolls. This is a non-LDS German scholar who wrote this. Why? Well, they also believed that the second coming, or at least end times of some sort, were imminent, right? It goes way back, so it's not that at some point that's going to be correct, right? It's not that end times are never imminent, and it's not. It's just a belief that people tend to have. So,
And the idea, I think, at its core is that Christianity ushers in the New Age, right? If you were to sum it up, I would
yes,
say that's the spirit of Christ
100%.
is one that ushers in the New Age. And so that's the spirit in which all of these people have been living and sort of moving towards. That's the spirit in which I think you participate in Christianity. So,
Yes. So this is a belief that people share. People are trying to map that. Now, in association with that, here's another theme. The theme is what we call dispensations. So dispensationalism is really invented right around the same time that Joseph Smith um, comes along. So, and the first invention of dispensationalism it's usually traced to this guy. Shoot, I'm gonna forget his name. He lived in Ireland, um,
Philip
and
Morrow?
he was born in eight. John Nelson Darby is the guy that usually is
Oh,
the
okay.
person to whom it's traced. Morrow's involved later. So John Nelson Darby is originally a minister in the Church of England who is Irish, and he's the one who comes up with this idea. And dispensationalism in evangelical or non-LDS world is a little different than we think of it. So if you're going to look and you just Google this, you'll find this. It's actually quite interesting. The typical structure is that you have seven dispensations: man before the flood, and then man after the flood, the dispensation of Abraham, the dispensation of Moses, the dispensation of Jesus Christ. And then in sort of traditional non-LDS thinking, you have a dispensation that's usually called tribulation or last days. And then you have the kingdom, which Christ comes to rule on the earth again. Now it's the kingdom of God, it's the millennium. Does that make sense? So this idea that the world or the Bible can be, or the history of God's dealings with his people can be divided into these categories we know as dispensations. This is an idea that comes from the same basic era. Now, Darby is contemporary with Joseph Smith, so he hasn't had a chance to have an influence. But the general idea of dispensationalism, maybe not in Darby wasn't working in a vacuum either, I guess is my point. So when you look at, for example, the book of Revelation, what are the seven seals supposed to mean? one of the first things the Latter-day Saints ask the Lord is, what do these seven seals mean? Everybody wants to know what the seven seals mean. And one interpretation of the seven seals is it's a series of dispensations. It's a series of ways in which, or laws through which, or teachings through which God is interacting with humans. And this idea that we were in a new dispensation, that things were changing, was a pretty hard one to ignore in a world like Joseph Smith's, because you had this break from Catholicism that was still, relatively new. And then, as we just read, there were break after break after break. There were people who were, in some ways religiously creative, but in many ways they were just living their lives. And then a spiritual feeling or a revelation or an understanding of doctrine that was different than what they had been taught would sort of jump them. And they'd be like, everything's wrong. How do I fix it? And some of them came to the conclusion that Roger Williams came to. And I don't know if you want to read that quote again, Cam, but there's a bunch of other quotes from Roger Williams that are also pretty good.
Yeah. Yeah, I can
But
read the
I don't know.
I can read those two that I read last time if you'd like.
Yeah, that'd be
The
great.
first one looks like this is actually, never mind. I'm not going to put a year on it because that was the year the book was published and not the year the quote was said. So the first one, there is no regularly constituted church of Christ on earth. And just for reference, Josh, if I understand right, this is the guy who founds the First Baptist Church and the state of Rhode Island. Is that more or less right?
Yeah, Roger Williams is a Protestant minister who is exceptionally eminent. He actually was counselor to Edward Cook, who was a counselor to the king. Was kind of a big deal. Came to Massachusetts and got kicked out of Massachusetts and almost banished for preaching a few things that the Massachusetts Bay Colony Puritans didn't agree with. And he founds Rhode Island. That he was involved in the founding of the Baptist Church in the sense that he rejected the standard Puritan explanation for infant baptism, which was tied it to circumcision, and but basically was baptized into this Baptist Church in America, but was sort of immediately disavowing it for the reasons that he says here, if that makes sense.
Okay.
Like, that's what's happening here. This is him. I believe he's baptized into this denomination that he has helped to create in Rhode Island, where he was sort of the father of religious liberty.
Okay.
And then immediately
preaching.
leaves. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So he says there's no regularly constituted Church of Christ on earth, nor any person qualified to administer any church ordinances, nor can there be until new apostles are sent by the great head of the church, for whose coming I am seeking. And then the other quote, which is in a similar vein, just says, the apostasy hath so far corrupted all that there can be no recovery out of that apostasy until Christ shall send forth new apostles to plant churches anew. So this was an expectation that he had.
Yeah. And he wasn't alone. There were a lot of folks who thought this. One of the problems that you always have whenever you're in the middle of trying to do something new is, well, what's my authority? Where's my call? Who gave it to me? And so you have this gets us to another one of our themes. So we've talked about millenarianism, this belief that the second coming is imminent and that Christians are the ones that need to prepare the world to usher it in. You have this idea that and then on top of the millenarianism, then you have this idea that there is a what I would call let's just get the idea that there's a restoration needed, that there's you immediately start to asking yourself, okay, by what authority are we doing these things? And sometimes the answer is, well, okay, if it's the fruit of a poisonous tree, which was a language that Roger Williams himself used at times, then how can the fruit of a poisonous tree not itself be poisonous? And so how can I, having left the Church of England, and actually having left before that the Catholic Church, how can I now have authority? So people are looking for this idea of authority. Now, a couple of other things that are important. There's this idea that there's going to be a new heaven and a new earth. And this idea that there is going to be a heavenly Zion here on earth, which is how you're going to prepare for the second coming of Jesus. This is the idea that animates the colonization of the New World. And in fact, there are a lot of very, very, very wealthy Puritans, and they're giving money so that people can immigrate to the New World for the purpose of creating the New Jerusalem, or what they also call Zion from time to time, although that's not as common of a term for it. And the whole purpose of the settlement, especially the Massachusetts Bay Colony, is to create this new heaven and new earth. John Cotton, who was one of the most famous preachers and ministers in the New World, wrote to his friend John Davenport, "The order of the churches and the Commonwealth brought to mind the new heaven and the new earth." If you read a book there's a book out there, it's called The Pilgrim's Progress. You ought to read it for the fun of it. If you really want to understand Protestant theology at this time, Puritan theology at this time, it's a fantastic way to do it. Because it's a extended allegory, sort of explaining the journey of this allegorical character from where he starts out to and where he ends up is in the New Jerusalem. So this is why the Puritans of New England were so anxious to have God controlling everything. And in the end, Roger Williams is the one who says, well, what you actually need is freedom of religion, because you guys are squelching anything you don't agree with, and you're taking unto yourselves authority that you don't have. And that's why Roger Williams winds up being the guy who says, I don't see anybody with authority. I need somebody with authority, because he's experienced the unrighteous exercise of authority. And so that's another theme.
And it seems like also recognizes that you can't just remove yourself from your mother tree and then exist in a vacuum. Is that right?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So you have millenarianism, the need to create a Zion and a New Jerusalem that are absolutely in the air for 200 years prior to Joseph. You have the question of authority, which comes up because of all of these people doing all of these things, right? And then you have a couple of other things that are really important. One of the big questions that is on everybody's mind is this conflict that you have between spiritual witnesses that you receive on an internal level and the received authority of whoever is in charge. So 1631, you have probably one of the most famous, most well-documented heresy trials in the history of certainly of non-Catholic world, which is that for a woman called Anne Hutchinson. Anne is a believer in an inner light, a belief that the inner light that we get, the spiritual revelations that we get internally, those are more important than received authority. It's not the minister's place to tell you what is true or what you must believe. It is your place to obtain that directly from God through directly felt inspiration. This is what Ronald Knox was talking about in the quote that I read from Enthusiasm. The individual is the authority, and the purpose of the minister is to create an environment in which that can thrive. And yes, there is a structure there, but it is all up for negotiation. So there's this idea that received structures can be destroyed if there's a good reason for it. And the good reason for it is typically a personal revelation or a felt spirit. Now, Anne Hutchinson is, of course, excommunicated. She's banished and winds up living in Aquidneck, which is a place that eventually becomes part of Rhode Island, and gets protected by the laws that get created by Roger Williams in Rhode Island. Although I can't remember if she herself survives to see it become Rhode Island or not. So that's another theme. So to go over the themes again, we have millenarianism, we have the idea of a New Jerusalem, we have the questions about authority, and we have the idea of the Holy Spirit being able to reveal to you directly what it is that's most important and what it is that you ought to do. This idea that you can get direct revelation from God for yourself about what you ought to do, and you ought not listen to, or at least not exclusively listen to, other people. Make sense? So these are some themes that are all out there and have been out there for many hundreds of years. Now, I'm not going to insult the intelligence of the folks listening by sort of going too much detail about how the restoration answers each one of those, but clearly we read section 1. This is a millenarian movement. It is there. The purpose is to prepare the earth for the second coming of Jesus Christ. Second, by 1831, Joseph has already, by November 1831, when D&C 1 comes out, Joseph has already translated all of the what we today call the Book of Moses. And Joseph himself, in Revelations, without going into all the details, they start being worried about persecution, and so they start using pseudonyms. And the pseudonym Joseph uses is Enoch. Why
To
does he
describe
use the
himself.
pseudonym Enoch? Well, to describe himself. Yes, correct. And why does he use it? Well, he uses that pseudonym because he sees himself as a modern day Enoch. He has already translated the Book of Moses that actually happens in December 1830. Well, it happens between June 1830 and December 1830. So very, very, very early on. And Joseph has this sense of who he is. In Moses 7, Joseph Smith is clearly and distinctly prophesied of. That's how he sees it. He is the truth and righteousness that's supposed to flood the earth. That is the mission that Joseph has for himself. And that is the mission. That mission entails the creation of Zion, of a new Jerusalem. And that new Jerusalem that's supposed to be created in the last days, that's supposed to match the one that Enoch created, Joseph knows about that. And he's thinking about that. And that's part of the movement. Like inside of 9 months from the organization formally of the church. So you have in Mormonism, it's clearly a millenarian movement. You have this idea of Zion, the New Jerusalem, being built here on the American continent, as we like to say in the 10th article of faith. You have on top of that, you have this idea that there is authority that has been missing. There's apostolic authority that has been missing, that you must get directly from heaven. And it's brought back. It's brought back by Joseph. Well, it's really brought back by Peter, James, and John to Joseph and Oliver. So they now are claiming we have the authority that is necessary to organize the church. So this idea that you need to leave, and they have actually dealt with, so this Anne Hutchinson idea that this antinomianism is what it's called, this idea that you can receive your own revelations. This idea is a two-edged sword, they found, and that's why you have actually the same exact summer, the summer of 1830, where Joseph is working on the translation of the Book of Moses for the first time. He is also dealing with Hiram Page and the seer stone, and he's dealing with another incident that we will talk about. We'll talk about both of these incidents in later episodes, but another incident in which Oliver Cowdery commands him to change. Oliver Cowdery writes him a letter and commands him in the name of the Lord to change some of the wording in section 20, which was received April-ish 1830, and in roughly the same time that the church is founded, and wants him to change part of the revelation because he believes it to be untrue. And Joseph refuses. And And Joseph has to go and calm everybody down about Hiram Page and the seer stone. And he actually makes 2 trips from Harmony, Pennsylvania, where he's living at the time, up to New York to the Whitmer home to calm down the Whitmers. Hiram Page, by the way, for those who don't know, is essentially a Whitmer family member. He's married to one of the Whitmer daughters. And Oliver Cowdery marries one of the Whitmer daughters too. So it's basically a Whitmer family type of a situation that's going on. So Joseph has to calm all those things down. So he's dealing with a kind of Ann Hutchinsonism in his own church, which is, against his authority. And then he's also dealing with or benefiting from the fact that people, when they get the Book of Mormon and they read it and they pray, they do not feel, many of them, like the first thing that they must do is call their minister and ask him about it. They feel like the first thing they must do is ask the Lord. They are prepared in our modern way of thinking of it, to accept and believe in the truthfulness of Moroni's promise in Moroni 10. They're ready to do that, and that's what they do. I don't know if you have any thoughts, Cam. I was going to go on to one other point, and then maybe we've gotten where we need to go. But
Yeah, a couple of things. I might have read this verse last time, but this is one I love in 2 Nephi 27. I'm a God, excuse me. For behold, I am God, and I am a God of miracles, and I will show unto the world that I am the same yesterday, today, and forever, and I work not among the children of men, save it be according to their faith. This goes back to this notion we were talking about earlier of heaven and earth sort of mutually reaching for each other, right? This idea that draw near unto me and I'll draw near unto you. That as heaven is, excuse me, as those on earth are reaching up, those in heaven are reaching down, and there's kind of this communion of the two coming together. That level of faith is what then invites his involvement. That's what invites him to make bare his holy arm, let's say, to reveal himself, to call laborers into the vineyard.
yeah, I think I wanted to make one other point about this. So Richard Bushman is talking about, when he talks about Joseph, he talks about him and his family as seekers. I actually think that's probably it might be an apt description of Aciel Smith and sort of the Smith side of the family. It's probably not an apt description of the Mac side of the family. And it may be a little bit of an anachronism. The Seekers were a specific group, and it was they were the ones who were looking for, they were the ones concerned about authority, apostolic authority. Now, another sort of branch off of that Seekerism, though, is, and to keep our facts all straight, Roger Williams and the Baptists tend toward, they're not always this, but they tend toward being seekers, which are people who believe that there is no true church because God's authority has to restore the true church, and everything is the fruit of a poison tree up to this point. So let's talk for just a minute about the 2 types of folks who joined the early church. And the first group I want to talk about are the group that are the first members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. The first members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints are people who are primarily from upstate New York. They wind up forming what becomes known as the Colesville branch of the church. Not all of them are part of the Colesville branch, but a huge percentage of them are. And they have a set of a religious background that is quite a bit different than the religious background of the other large group that joins the LDS Church. So, and they're a little bit more eclectic. It's not as much of a pattern. Let's start with the Whitmers. The Whitmers, before they joined the LDS Church, we have record that the Whitmers were a part of a German Reformed church, which was not far from their house. This is whenever you see the word Reformed, that means Calvinism. And it is, so their beliefs would have been similar to those of, say, Lucy Macksmith, who was a Presbyterian church member, and perhaps similar to well, very similar to, so similar to theologically to the Puritans that it would have that their ministers were interchangeable. So that's the Whitmers. But then you have guys like a huge influence down there were the Knights, Joseph Knight Jr. and Joseph Knight Sr., very heavily involved in the Colesville branch. These were much more like Joseph Smith Sr. These were folks who maybe weren't even churchgoers, or if they were churchgoers, were on the edge of church attendance, and were what I would call what would you call it? Sort of almost Christian. What did we say last time? Cowboys, Christian cowboys. Cam. They sort of had their own. They weren't cowboys, of course, but they were very independent, spirited Christians who had their own beliefs and weren't necessarily part of any system. And we're just kind of waiting for a revelation of God's truth. Martin Harris would have been in the same category. The whole Smith side of the family would have been in the same category. To the extent these folks belonged to churches, they tended to belong to Methodist churches. Methodism at the time was a relatively new faith. It was only about 100 years old, give or take. And it was where there was a lot still of evangelical enthusiasm going on. A lot of the tent meetings that Joseph attended, we know, were Methodists. And Brigham Young would have belonged to this category. He was in this category. William W. Phelps would have been in this category. William W. Phelps was also from upstate New York. John Taylor, to some extent, to a lesser extent. John Taylor's from Canada. Some of my ancestors were living by John Taylor when they were converted, living there in Canada. This is this group of what I'll call seekers. It's a little bit anachronistic, but I think it's right. These are people who are saying, none of these churches look quite right to me, and I'm waiting for what church I ought to be looking for. That's who the Colesville branch, or the folks from New York, are dominated by. That's a group of folks who are probably a little, from our perspective, superstitious. They may be into sort of Christian magic, which we'll deal with in another episode. They are not necessarily involved in any church. If they are in a church, it tends to be a Methodist church or a less organized, kind of less authoritarian church. And they're very open-minded folks. And by and large, that's who they are. The Whitmers are actually not like them. Compared to all of them, the Whitmers are far more on the respectable side of the way that you look at the world, and theologically are much more traditional. So you have that group, and then you have a totally separate group. This totally separate group joins the church because of Parley Pratt, by and large. And this group is what today we would call Campbellites, today we might call them members of the Church of Christ or Disciples of Christ movement. This is Parley Pratt was one of them. This is basically everybody, with a few exceptions, everybody who joins the church from Kirtland, Ohio and environs. These are folks who are not entirely, but almost to a person, members of a Campbellite denomination. It grows out of Baptists. It is the main goal of Alexander Campbell is to the restoration of the primitive church. That is their only thing that they're interested in. So they are not charismatics in the way that they don't tend towards charismatic. For those who don't know what charismatic means, they don't tend towards like spiritual gifts type stuff like The Colesville branch would be much more into spiritual gifts. These folks, Alexander Campbell's famous comment was, where the Bible speaks, we speak. Where the Bible is silent, we are silent. Alexander Campbell's whole thing was to go to the Bible, look very carefully at every single piece of organization, every single piece of doctrine, and try to create it, recreate it exactly the way it ought to be created. The
And
folks in Kirtland,
to just accent that real quickly, and I think the big difference, right, or the point of emphasis is that they're doing it primarily by stripping away or by getting rid of everything that they perceive as being a tradition that they've inherited that they can't find strictly within what's already there in the text, but not necessarily
they think that.
seeking the revelation to add
Right.
things that have been missing or to fill in, a larger picture. Strictly by
They absolutely
stripping away.
are not seekers. Yeah, they are not seekers. They are not trying, they do not believe that they need authority to do that. They believe the authority was already done. The authority is the Bible. So sola scriptura, that's sort of the standard way of thinking of it. That's what they believe. You're right. They are not, most of them, thinking of it in terms of spiritual gifts. Now, there are some exceptions. And it may be that the exceptions are the reasons why those folks wind up joining the church. So the way that, for those of you who don't know, Parley Pratt is the one who introduces them. Parley Pratt is a Campbellite living in Kirtland. And if you haven't seen How Rare a Possession, you should. It's a true story about what happens. Parley Pratt has a spiritual impression he needs to get off the ferry on the Erie Canal that he's on. In and around Palmyra, and doesn't know why, and comes into contact with the Book of Mormon, joins the church, and goes, and then gets assigned at their conference. All of this is happening in 1830. September 1830, they have what is, we'll call it the first, or if you want to call it, you can call it the second. I don't actually know how the church counts it. General Conference. September 1830. And during this, Oliver Cowdery is sent on a mission to the Indian tribes. And Parley Pratt is assigned to go with them. And as they're going on their way to the Indian tribes, they do eventually go there. They stop in Ohio because Parley Pratt wants to talk to his minister, who is Sidney Rigdon. And he wanted to talk to all his friends. Isaac Morley. Isaac Morley and this group are living by this time so remember the themes: millenarianism, the idea that you need new apostles. And I didn't mention primitivism, but primitivism is really separate. This idea that you need to rebuild the primitive church, the idea of a new heaven and a new earth, or a new Jerusalem to prepare the worth. Isaac Morley and many of the folks, Newell K. Whitney, the Johnsons, are already trying to live a kind of united order. Because again, they're looking at the scriptures and they're saying, I need to live with all things in common, because that's what the primitive Christians did. They're already trying to do that. So when they get the message, they're prepared to hear it. They're prepared in the sense that they want a restoration of the primitive church. They're now convinced this is a restoration of the primitive church. The authority piece of it is actually exciting to them, because many of them in the back of their minds have been wondering about whether Alexander Campbell's position, which is that the Bible gives you all the authority you need, is really a sensible position. And now they're very willing to accept this idea that maybe it isn't. Sidney Rigdon himself makes incredible sacrifices to join the LDS Church, and in fact is about to move into a brand new house that his congregation in Mentor, Ohio, has built for him. And they kick him out, and he has no way to make a living, and is going to have to go back to doing all kinds of manual labor stuff that he has left. And I want to pay tribute to him and to his wife for being willing to accept the restoration. So then, okay, so now you have these two groups. They are not the same, but they're similar. And of course, they've both embraced the LDS Church, and they have this sort of different traditions from which they're deriving themselves or coming. And so their ideas of various doctrines are quite a bit different. So what happens is Sidney Rigdon and Edward Partridge come to visit Joseph. They come down. This is in um, the fall. Really, it's by the time they are preached to, it's winter, and they get in either late November or early December. They arrive in Palmyra, and they want to visit Joseph. Edward Partridge wants to go because he won't be baptized until he meets Joseph. And when he meets him, he's immediately realizes, no, this is the thing I need to do. And almost immediately, Sidney Rigdon starts to write for Joseph. He starts to write down, and what he's writing is Joseph's dictation of the Book of Moses, which is a part of at the time, the inspired revision of the scriptures. So Joseph goes in 1831 back to Kirtland, and the reason I'm giving you all this history is I want you guys to understand just how these two groups actually stay separate for a long time. So Joseph is in 1831, he travels back to Kirtland. He gets the revelation, go to the Ohio. This is and there you'll get my law. He goes to the Ohio, and the idea is everybody's going to gather to Ohio. So without going into all the details, Lehman Copley is going to give his farm to all the Colesville Saints, and they're going to settle on it. So all the Colesville branch, which is a few hundred people, they pack up their stuff and they come to Ohio expecting to have a place to live. And when they get there, Lehman Copley has changed his mind because he wouldn't convert his Shaker friends. We could talk about the Shakers too. That's a whole nother thing. But and the Colesville branch, it's just been revealed that Zion is to be in Jackson County, Missouri. And so the Colesville branch is actually sent to Missouri to settle there instead. And so, as I said, you now have this whole group that's living in Missouri under the leadership mostly of Oliver Cowdery and the Whitmers. And you have another group that's living in Kirtland. The group that's living in Kirtland is the one we know the most about. That's where all the revelations are happening. That's where D&C 76 is being received. That's where the temple is about to be built. That's where the opposition to the church is starting. There's opposition in Missouri too, but it's a different kind. And you have these two groups with somewhat different ideas about how the church, what these doctrines are. Doctrines like salvation, how does it happen? What is faith? None of those things become a focus for Joseph Smith. The preaching is about the Book of Mormon, and it's about a new restoration, and it's about preparing the earth for the second coming through creating a Zion. That's what the preaching's about. And then you have a whole group, you've got converts that are coming in that are of a mixed bag, and you've got a third group that we'll talk about in later episodes. That's really folks coming from England. And most of them fall more into the camp of sort of the Colesville branch. But so anyway, that's the history, and those are the folks that are joining the LDS Church, and they join for what I think are pretty straightforward reasons, Cam. They have been exceptionally prepared to hear the word. And the missionaries who are sent out right from the very beginning are visiting these people and finding them to be receptive to the ideas that are out there, because they've been so well prepared by these issues that are sort of floating around in Christianity at the time. So I don't know. What do you think? Questions, thoughts? What is anything that brings to mind for you? I'd love to sort of talk about this stuff if it's useful.
Yeah, one thing that's been so there's a book that I'd highly recommend, and if you want to get maybe just more of kind of a high level understanding of what it's about, you can look up some interviews the guy's done. But he's a historian. His name's Tom Holland, not the actor who plays Spider-Man, but a historian from the
bad luck.
UK. And the book's called Dominion. What it basically traces is the impact that Christ's life has and its reverberation, let's say, throughout the rest of history to today. And to connect that to a point you made last time, um, this stuff wasn't just like cotton candy to people. This was like the
Yes.
foundational fabric of society, right? This is like the lens through which they saw and experienced the world. And so there's not like you can't really distinguish or pull apart the reasons people were migrating to America and the religious purposes that they were converging on or oriented towards, right? The things they were focusing on, the things they valued. And so the world into which Joseph Smith is born and the world into which this whole restoration thing comes together is one that is already deeply um, invested in and trying to exercise faith and moving towards the thing that Christianity is intended to bring about, right? So
Yeah.
I guess maybe just to put an exclamation point on your point here, religion was no it was no small thing to these people. It was the highest purpose that everything tended to.
Yeah. I'm not sure that you could have had a restoration at a time where when people didn't take it as seriously as that, actually.
Now, one question that I guess it'd be worth discussing is given that this is sort of the motion that everyone is going through. This is the ideal that they're all kind of striving towards. What is it about Joseph Smith that makes him different? And why is it that the Lord is involved in a way that he wasn't involved in the iterations or the generations that led up to this? Or how does it differ?
Um, well, when it's first getting started, we don't have an appreciation, I don't think, for quite how the order of these things happens. But when it's first getting started, it feels like the appeal is to this exact thing, and all these movements that are out there. But it doesn't take very long before Joseph is making people upset, or put better, the revelations of the Lord are making people upset. Um, a really good example is Doctrine and Covenants section 76. Now, because it's section 76, there's a tendency, I guess, amongst folks like us to think, well, Doctrine and Covenants section 76, that must have been a long time, after section 1. No, it was it was less than 6 months after section 1. About 4 months later, February 1832, you get Doctrine and Covenants section 76. And we don't understand Doctrine and Covenants section 76 the way that it was understood so clearly at the time. At the time Doctrine and Covenants section 76 comes out, you have people apostatizing from the church all over the place because it is teaching a form of universalism. And they recognize that. They recognize that, in fact, everybody is going to be saved in a kingdom that is a kingdom of glory and that would have been recognized on some level as heaven. And you have people standing up in meetings and saying things like, I no more believe the vision to be a vision of God than I believe the devil was crucified, and leaving the church. You have this, you brought up ex nihilo creation. Ex nihilo creation is an absolute foundational point of Christianity. I am not aware. I'm sure there have been some heretics at some point who were questioning whether ex nihilo creation was the method of creation or not. I am not aware of a significant controversy in and around the time and place of Joseph Smith about that, though. Among American denominations, it was not a point of discussion. And yet, very early on, Joseph is teaching that creation is not ex nihilo, that in fact, it is from pre-existing matter. And as he get later into Nauvoo, Joseph is teaching that, in fact, matter exists from all eternity to all eternity, and human beings exist from all eternity to all eternity and are not simply created by God for his good pleasure. Those are absolutely revolutionary doctrines, complete changes. A couple other things. Joseph is talking about something called Melchizedek priesthood. To this day, nobody has any idea where, what I mean by nobody, what I mean is those who are looking for naturalistic explanations of the church and of Joseph Smith have absolutely no idea where the idea of a Melchizedek priesthood can really be found in the scriptures. It's just not, and by what I mean in the scriptures is in the Bible, in the pre-existing scriptures. And yet it makes perfect sense that there would be a Melchizedek priesthood. And as we learn in the JST version of Genesis, Melchizedek is another Enoch figure. He's someone who turns around in a completely wicked world and creates a just society, a society where that's prepared to join the society of Enoch and has the same power. So that's another structural thing. It makes no, it's just not relevant or related to anything somebody started with already, an idea that they already had. And we could go through, probably the single most odd idea of Joseph's is that the gospel has been the same forever. And that in fact, in the Book of Mormon, from the very beginning, from the Book of Mormon, from Book of Moses, takes this another step farther. But the Book of Mormon is saying you have people in Old Testament times who have access to a Melchizedek priesthood, who are performing baptisms, who are experiencing evangelical conversions, who are experiencing the remission of their sins through Jesus Christ, who are calling themselves Christian 600 years before Jesus. Is a completely and totally original idea that has absolutely nothing to do with anything that came before it. And in fact, to this day, I don't know that there has been a more original and yet compelling perspective on the historical record than that one. It's an incredibly compelling point of view that just did not exist. And it's one of the big criticisms Alexander Campbell has of the Book of Mormon. And I could go on and on and on and on and on, Cam, with all the things. But the idea that, oh, it was an outgrowth, the LDS Church was nothing more than an outgrowth of all of these, things that were out there is not true. In fact, it's exactly what you would expect, which is it is what people are looking for because they are inspired to be looking for it. And yet it is not what they thought it was going to be. I don't know about you, Cam, but whenever the Lord teaches me something, it is always building on something I thought I knew or that I already had accepted and then taking it to another step. That's the pattern, right?
Yeah.
And so I think it's really worth emphasizing that. I'm glad you asked the question because it's worth emphasizing the point that this is not some kind of a emanation of all of the stuff that was out there in the world, because it's quite different in many very, very important ways. And by the way, entirely original. No one had supposed any of that stuff.
Yeah. Well, and part of the pattern too, to go back to the Moses 7 reference with Enoch and New Jerusalem and the last days and Joseph's mission, is he is describing righteousness coming down from heaven and truth coming up out of the earth.
Yes.
In its fullest sense, that's probably something like the records and the words that have been written on earth, things like the gold plates are coming up out of the earth, and righteousness, coming in the form of angels and translated beings and resurrected beings coming down, right? And Enoch Zion coming down, that sort of thing. But in a fractal sort of way, this speaks to, again, the pattern of this mutual reaching between heaven and earth. sometimes I'll use the analogy of, you're gathering up the mountain to receive the Spirit that comes down. That's a pattern that we see over and over and over again in the scriptures. As a matter of fact, if you read, for example, 3 Nephi 21, when it's describing um, the gathering of Israel that takes place in the last days, the gathering of the elect, they all come together, and then the power of heaven comes down among them, and then Christ's presence comes down among them, and it adds something to that body that makes it more than the sum of its parts. The same is true for, Ezekiel. It's either 36 or 37. I think it's 37. Talks about the valley of the valley of dry bones, and it likens the sort of resurrection imagery to the gathering and the redemption of Israel in the last days, right? So you see it all come together, and then the Spirit comes down and inhabits it, and it makes it something different than just a body put together again, right? I mean, even to take it a step further, within any given person, people are more than just the the combination of all of their like matter, right? And you can especially see this with the difference between a living person and a dead person. When you have a spirit, this is the spiritual heavenly component of a soul, right? Of a person that makes them more than just the sum of their physical parts. Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah.
There's a very
Yeah.
real
No,
sense
yeah.
in which heaven and earth come together in a similar way, in which revelation happens in a similar way, which is there are components in heaven that come together, but they receive something, excuse me, components on earth that come together, but they receive something from above that, to your point, expands on them in a way that was not, it wasn't just people forcing it together, but there was actually something that was received from above as well.
Yeah. Well, this will be a theme. This will be a theme throughout our discussions in this podcast. The theme will be the ways in which um, the Lord draws upon the resources or the existing knowledge or understanding of the folks here on earth, and then gives them something new to ponder or to deal with that is unexpected. And and the theme will be, I think, because a lot of history is written in a very one-sided way, the theme will be to look at what's actually here, all of it, at the same time. Because if you wanted to be the person who was making the case that this is all just of the earth, you can make that case. You can go through all the stuff that we went through, and there's a lot more that you could go through, and say it's all just of earth. But you can only do that by cutting off some very clearly delineated things. And I just think, you know, it all happens really fast, guys. Doctrine and Covenants section 88 is given, the end of it's given in January 1833. So we're talking about under 3 years to get to section 88. And if you want to go from the founding of the church in April 1830, you are in section 92 by the time you are 3 full years in. That is an incredible amount of revelation between section 1 and section 92. Incredibly beautiful and profound and original thoughts, all of which can be found there. And so I don't want to overstate this contextual stuff, but I don't want to understate it either. I think it's really, really important that we understand why this stuff made sense to people. And so I think hopefully that we've done that in this episode. And with that, Cam, I don't have much else. If you've got anything else you want to talk about, let's get it out there. But I feel like we've done what we can do here.
If you were to maybe tie it off or sum it up or give a singular theme to this entire episode, what's kind of the focal point that we've been driving towards, and how does it relate to Joseph as a believer?
Mm. Yeah, I think the focal point that we've been driving towards more than anything else is that Joseph was coming along in response to the prayers of literally millions of people over hundreds of years. Good people who knew that what they had wasn't enough on some level, but didn't know what they needed to do next, didn't have the wisdom and the knowledge that they needed, and that he was an answer to their prayers. And many of them were able to recognize him as an answer to their prayers. Some of them only could recognize that temporarily. You've got guys like Ezra Booth and Simon Ryder who recognized it and then lost the thread. But a lot of people could see that this was an answer to their prayers. And I really think that's important. It's important for a whole bunch of reasons, but one of those reasons is we need to be looking around for the answers to our prayers. We need to understand that God does answer prayers and that it is sometimes a multi-generational process that we are participating in to make that happen. And I really think that's, to me, the big thing here. Joseph was an answer to the prayers of millions of people.
Love it. I love
All
it.
right. Well, that's all I think we have time for today, Cam. Thank you so much for everything that we've been able to share here today. I hope that you guys learned something that you maybe hadn't thought of. And if you did know this stuff, that's also good. Maybe we were able to remind you of some things that you previously knew. I think in our next episode, we're going to tackle probably some other stuff about Joseph's childhood. And don't miss it. Thanks so much for joining us. See you later.